very briefly. After Israel captured Jerusalem and the old city during the Six-Day War, it was Moshe Dayan who then they had the Waqf, which is the area of the Temple Mount, which is going to come to play in a little bit, he returned the keys symbolically to the Waqf, to the Islamic administration that was responsible for it. They were shocked and they were surprised. They said, "You just won this in the war; it's yours." And he said, no, we don't want there to be any kind of territorial claims or anything like that. And so he said, you will continue to administer the areas. That was Moshe Dayan. That wasn't necessarily a decision going for or against. It might have just been a stupid decision, but it wasn't necessarily one that was going for or against a constituency there. So now talking about Ariel Sharon, they begin by calling him a man of many contrasts. He had a fierce stroke of independence in all that he did. He was willing to challenge and often to disregard orders of his superiors. He did what he thought was the right course of action. He was a guy who very much believed in creating results, that the ends justified the means, but was also always willing to assume responsibility for tough decisions that he made, and controversial ones as well. Like Rabin, he was born in Israel, and having been born and growing up in a moshav, where his family's farm and other villagers were often concerned with their security because of attacks from neighboring Arabs, he had a concern for security and also a distrust of Arabs. To understand Sharon, we really have to begin with a brief but important overview of his military career. He served in the IDF for over 25 years and was a military man through and through. He joined the Haganah in 1942 at the age of 14. Can you imagine? 14 years old. And he was at the center of many of Israel's most important battles. In fact, from the founding of Israel in 1948 all the way through the Yom Kippur War in 1973, he played a prominent role in pretty much every significant military conflict or battle that Israel was engaged in. So let me share with you a little bit of what happened. First, we'll begin with the War of Independence. We've discussed, and again, to put this into context, Ben-Gurion's decision to declare independence and his decision to break the Arab barricade or embargo in order to send supplies to Jews in Jerusalem. We talked about Yitzhak Rabin's role in helping to make that happen and leading that force. We talked about Menachem Begin's role at the time of the 1948 war, especially the Atalina affair, where they tried to bring in the weapons and the ship was sunk by Ben-Gurion and so on. So now let's take a look at the role of this fourth individual, Ariel Sharon, in the 1948 war. Because after the British withdrew from the fortification, which was known as Latrun, and again, you pass by it on the way between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in 1948, they handed the fort over to Jordan's Arab Legion, who used the fort to shell Israeli vehicles that were coming on the road. So when he was only 20 years old, he commanded an infantry company fighting against Jordanian troops who were there. His platoon was isolated during the assault on the stronghold, and it was a terrible operation, unsuccessful. His platoon was destroyed. Many of his soldiers were killed or seriously wounded, including him. Now, the problems he identified were, number one, communications were not well coordinated. Number two, as a result, they didn't know that they were all alone in advancing, and that the forces who were supposed to be there with them weren't there, and reinforcements didn't arrive. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever read about this or heard about it. It's detailed in the book, O Jerusalem. But many of the Israeli fighters were young survivors of the Holocaust. Some of them had just arrived in the country like the day before. They had obviously no military training, and those who did have minimal military training, many of them couldn't even speak Hebrew and didn't understand the orders that were being given. So out of this experience, Sharon realized how important it was to have senior officers making decisions and that they be on the front, not relying on information that they were getting from radio transmitted messages of people who were in the field. Another important thing that happened and had an impact on him. The bodies of the soldiers who were killed were mutilated by the Arabs. And Sharon concluded at that point, which has become a key point of Israeli military policy, never to leave any wounded behind on the battlefield. And after this, he had a ruthless approach and pretty much little concern for the casualties that he would inflict and his troops would inflict on the enemy. Sharon was gifted with a laser-like focus on details, especially in terms of military operations, maps, geographically, and later on in terms of peace talks, negotiations, and settlements as well. In July of 1953, Sharon, so now it's 5 years after the War of Independence, he was appointed head of a commando group, which was charged with conducting reprisal raids against Jordanian border villages. This was in response to a number of incursions by Arabs where they would come and they would kill people and so on. And so they would carry out dangerous missions, mainly at night, going into not just Arab villages nearby, but even into further deep into Arab states. They would ambush traffic between Arab villages, and they would attack bases and bridges and army bases. And the purpose of this operation and this unit was so that they, Israel's Arab enemies and neighbors would understand that they could not infiltrate Israel and kill its citizens with impunity. There was one notable attack, a retaliatory attack, and this was one of the first times that Sharon really began to become, people took notice of him, was on the village of Kibbia, which is in the West Bank. There was, an action was taken because of a terror attack in the Israeli town of Yehud. And so when they went into Kibbia, there was a whole big misunderstanding whether there were people still in the buildings or not, and so on. And afterwards, and Sharon claimed he didn't know there were civilians there. It left 69 Arab civilians dead, women and children. And so it evoked harsh criticism in Israel as well as abroad. In fact, the guy who was the foreign minister at the time, a guy named Moshe Sharet, opposed the operation. He wanted to fire Sharon right then and there. And this happened several times in Sharon's career when there were people who just, wanted to get rid of him. But he always had someone who was out there to help him, protect him. In this case, it was Ben Gurion. He was close to Ben Gurion. And Ben Gurion, actually, even though he denied any operating knowledge or knowledge of the operation, he still felt that it was valuable for Israel's enemies to see that Israeli forces would be capable of finding and hitting targets behind enemy lines, and he thought that would be helpful for Israel's security. So he didn't let Sharet fire him. Now we move forward from the 48 war, then these other operations, to now the 56 Sinai campaign. When Sharon commanded paratroopers who captured the strategic Mitla Pass in the central Sinai Peninsula. He was concerned about an enemy thrust coming through the pass, which then would be able to attack his brigade from the rear. So he sent in a small reconnaissance probe that was approved. That was met with enemy fire, heavy fire. But what happened was those guys became bogged down then with this heavy fire from the Egyptian forces and also a vehicle malfunction. So against the orders of his superiors, who told him to evacuate from there, and remember we said he decided he wasn't going to leave anyone on the battlefield, he sent in a battalion to go in, and he ordered the rest of his troops to attack in order to aid their comrades. The result was not good. There were heavy losses, and again, heavy criticism for his headstrong leadership, but there was some mixed praise for the fact that he, was forging forward and his decisiveness. Let's fast forward now to the Six-Day War. Okay, in May of 1967, any of you who remember or have read anything about it, it was a time of tremendous anxiety in Israel. What Egyptians had done was they remilitarized the Sinai, had the UN peacekeeping troops removed from there, declared a blockade against Israeli ships passing through the Straits of Tiran in Eilat. They formed an alliance with Syria. They had rallies of hundreds of thousands of people where Nasser shouted, Itbach Yahud, that we're going to slaughter the Jews and push them into the sea only 20 years after the Holocaust. All of this was going on, and the leader at the time was Levi Eshkol, who was a very quiet kind of a guy. He gave a speech to the nation where he was fumbling at the last minute. The speech was, some changes were made on the speech. He had trouble reading it, and it, instead of evoking confidence in the Israeli public, it evoked panic. Out in Tel Aviv, they prepared hundreds of thousands of body bags because they assumed there would be so many deaths, or tens of thousands of body bags. They assumed there would be tremendous casualties. So with that as the backdrop, Sharon had proposed to Rabin, who was the chief of staff at the time, that they, the military high command, should take power and hold the cabinet in detention so that the armed forces could launch a preemptive attack on Egypt, because Prime Minister Eshkol appeared unsure about how to respond. It was almost planning a coup. Rabin said, no way, and then the next day or a day or two later is when Israel did decide and plan to launch the preemptive attack in the Six-Day War. But it just shows again, how he really was like a bulldozer in so many respects in terms of what he wanted to do. Now, as you know, the Israeli Air Force destroyed most of Egypt's warplanes on the first day of the war, as well as of Syria and of Jordan and of elsewhere. So Israeli ground forces swept across the Sinai, where they encountered little opposition, and Sharon commanded one of the 3 armored divisions against Egypt. So now he really was hailed as a military hero, and pretty much any doubts or questions about his military prowess and leadership dissipated. So he then became the general officer of the Southern Command, which is a very important post. And there it's important because he was holding the line against Egypt's war of attrition. Most of us know of the 48 War, the 56 Sinai campaign, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. But between the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, there was something called a war of attrition, when Egyptian Fedayeen were sent across the Suez Canal, and they were coming in and attacking from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Sharon, as general officer of that area, was able to thwart those attacks and basically put an end to it.
Rabbi, excuse me, could you mute everyone, please?
What was that, Stan?
Could you please mute everybody? We're getting a lot of noise.
Okay, let me ask everyone to mute themselves. Stan, I'm having some trouble with my computer. Oh, wait, here, I think I might be able to do it. Okay, there we go. Got it. Okay, so everybody's now muted, and then if you do have questions to ask, please do feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you, Stan. Okay, so with his, predilection towards impulsivity and unpredictability, Sharon, needless to say, made many enemies, especially from the guys whose orders he kept defying, and as a result, he was denied the top army position that otherwise he may have deserved. Brings us now to the Yom Kippur War, 1973. As many of you may know, Israel's losses during those first days of the Yom Kippur were staggering. If you realize it or not, but 200 of the 300 first-line attacks were disabled in the first 24 hours, and within the first week, 800 in the other areas were disabled. And so, Sharon at this time was no longer an active military commander; he was commander of reserve unit. So he got to the battlefield, actually just driving a civilian Jeep in October 16th in the Sinai, and he rounded up his troops, led his reserve unit, and the decisive Israeli counterattack against Egypt westward along the Suez Canal. This battle was very significant, and it marked a turning point in the war. Again, Sharon disregarded orders from above, and he was told not to do what he did. He said, let them wait and attack you, and then you'll be able to get them. Instead, what he did was, under cover of darkness, he organized a counterattack to defeat the Egyptian Second Army. He was worried that they were going to come in and outflank him. So he went ahead, pushed across over the Suez Canal, encircled the Egyptian, undermining the Egyptian Second Army, and encircling the Egyptian Third Army, which was the decisive move in the Yom Kippur War, which effectively won the war for Israel and was regarded by Israelis at that time and till today pretty much as the turning point in the war and in the Sinai front. I'm having a little trouble with my keypad, but there was a picture I wanted to show you guys where he has his head is all bandaged, and and yet he still kept fighting, and it's a famous picture. If I'm able to show it to you afterwards, I shall. But with this, around this time, actually even right before the Yom Kippur War, because as I said, he was a general in the reserve forces, he'd actually started to go into politics. And he had been a Painik, which means like associated with Ben Gurion. But instead he became a strategist for the Likud. I'll never forget once hearing, it might have been David Makovsky many years ago, describing when Sharon was prime minister, that although he was the prime minister elected by Likud, in his office he had a picture of Ben Gurion, who was from the Mapai, the Labor Party, and he said, and the way that Sharon looked, he just looked like one of those old Mapainik guys, with the white collar shirt that was open and the big guy and everything. Again, if my computer works, I'll show you. He actually was a handsome young man when he was a general, but eventually, he just was a man of such great appetites in so many different ways. Okay, so the new prime minister who won, which we talked about last time, Menachem Begin, appointed Sharon as Minister of Agriculture. He ran for the Knesset, he was on the list, and there he was in a position where he was able to sponsor construction of Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria. In fact, and this is very important and significant, Sharon was viewed as the patron of the settlers movement because he used his various positions in government in order to encourage the establishment of a network of Israeli settlements to thwart the possibility of the return of Palestinian Arabs to those territories. So he doubled the number of Jewish settlements on the West Bank and Gaza Strip during his tenure. He opposed the concept of a Palestinian state. Instead, he proposed, anybody remember, he proposed a solution and said that Jordan is Palestine. So he felt that the territories in the West Bank should be retained by Israel, especially as a strategic asset for security purposes. And unlike the Labor Party guys, he didn't think they should be a bargaining chip in order to be used as swapped as land for peace. Well, in 1981, he became Minister of Defense under Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And some of you may know where this is headed. In that position, as Minister of Defense, Sharon was the principal architect of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in June of 1982. This war ultimately led to the removal from Lebanon of the PLO and of Yasser Arafat. They were exiled to Tripoli, Libya, and they had to leave with all of their troops. Here's what sparked it. Israel's ambassador to England was assassinated, Shlomo Argov. And this was the culmination that came after some 270 terrorist attacks launched from Lebanon by the PLO into Israel in the years preceding it. There were 20 attacks in the year or two before on Israeli targets abroad, such as the ambassador and others. And so Sharon intended to eradicate the PLO from its base in Lebanon, where it operated as a state within a state. It was called Operation Shalom LaGalil, bringing peace to the north, peace to the Galilee. So one of the goals was to push the PLO out, so they wouldn't be able to continue to offer the a threat there, to push them back, but also for Sharon, and there's a little, discussion and controversy. What did Menachem Begin know about this? What did Sharon keep to himself? But one of his goals was to create a new political reality on Israel's northern frontier. And in fact, there was a short period of time. Bashir Gemayel was elected prime minister, sympathetic towards Israel. I remember at the time it was always said that Lebanon would be the second country to sign a peace treaty with Israel, never the first, because they thought that Lebanon's interests were aligned and there was a strong Christian population and so on. But that was not meant to be. Bashir Gemayel was assassinated, and Israel wound up staying in Lebanon and getting bogged down there for some 18 years. So here's what happened. As I said, it was the summer of 1982 that Shalom LaGalil was launched. In early September, the militia members of a Maronite Christian Lebanese group who were aligned with Israel, known as the Phalangists. Israel was had control of the area nearby. These Phalangist group went into Palestinian refugee camps Sabra and Shatila, which was under, in area which Israel, broader area Israel was controlling. And they went in and the Christian Phalangists killed Palestinian refugees who were there. And there was widespread outrage over what Israel did, and especially towards Sharon. Outrage across the world, and in Israel as well. There were hundreds of thousands of people who came to a peace demonstration. I remember Menachem Begin at the time felt inappropriately blamed, that Israel was being inappropriately blamed. Forgive the terminology, but I'm going to quote what he said. He said, Goyim kill Goyim and Jews get blamed. And so that was what had happened in certain respects. But with this widespread outrage, there was a judicial commission of inquiry that was established, and it was called the Kahan Commission. They were severely critical of the whole thing of Sharon. And they said, although Israel did not direct it, nor did Sharon order it or anything like that, nevertheless, Israel was to take indirect responsibility for the massacres. because of the fact that it was an area that they were controlling. I happened to last night just to reread part of the Kahan report. Part of it refers to the Jewish experience in the diaspora when there would be pogroms and when we would feel that the ruling party should take responsibility. And it made reference to that in this report. And also other Talmudic principles were cited to make to say that Israel was indirectly responsible, and therefore they declared that Sharon was unfit to continue to serve in office as a defense minister. Now, you can imagine, and many of you, I'm sure, remember that he was specifically cited, and so as a result, he reluctantly had to resign as defense minister. He wasn't happy. In fact, he accused Begin of handing him over to a mob. And in February of 1983, he resigned as Minister of Defense, but he stayed in the government, stayed in the cabinet. Now, for almost anyone else, that would be the end of the story, and we'd be done, and there wouldn't be this class. But in 1984, he returned to office as Minister of Industry and Trade under Begin's successor, Prime Minister Shamir, also with the Likud government. He held this position then until 1990. And here are really important critical years. Between 90 and 92, he was Minister of Construction and Housing. Now, anybody remember what happened in between 90 and 92? That was the beginning of the opening of the floodgates of Russian immigration to Israel. And so there were, within a very short period of time, within that 1 year, actually, 300,000 Jews arrived from the former Soviet Union. With that now, again, he's the Minister of Housing, Construction and Housing. So he built 144,000 new homes, and he happened to exceed his budget, just as you shouldn't be surprised based on what I've said before, by the amount of 1.5 billion shekels. Billion. But he felt, this his job had to be done. He's got to do it, and he's going to do it. And they built in the settlement area. This was also the time of Baker threatening, not to approve the construction, the loans for Israel, the loan guarantee. It wasn't even a loan, but it was a loan guarantee for Israel, so that they'd be able to do this. And so there were, by the way, one of the things that comes out as I read Ross Makovsky's book is there are a number of times when the relationship with the United States was not good, or the relationship between the United States and the White House or the State Department or the administration was not good, and a lot of tense points. This was one of them, because Baker didn't want any more building in the West Bank. Now, in the next government that Sharon was to serve in, 96 to 99, when Netanyahu was the prime minister, he was Minister of National Infrastructure. And in that context, between 96 to 98, he was able to build a lot of roads and other kinds of things to help to serve the settlements. And then 98 to 99, he became foreign minister. So Ehud Barak was elected after 99. Labor won, and Sharon now was the leader of the Likud party, replacing Netanyahu. Now we go to the summer of 2000. Summer of 2000. Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel, goes to Camp David, enters into talks with the PLO and with Arafat, offers a extremely significant offer, as many of us know and remember, something like 90% of the West Bank, along with ability to, along with parts of Jerusalem, et cetera, et cetera. Arafat turns it down. And in September, and shortly after he turns it down, there are, some minor, there is tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Well, on September 28th of 2000, again, Barak is prime minister, and Sharon is leader of the opposition. He goes and makes a visit to the Temple Mount. And he goes there in order to emphasize Israel's claim of sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Now, Israel's security minister, internal security minister, a guy named Shlomo Ben Ami, permitted Sharon to visit the Temple Mount. And he permitted it after calling the Palestinian security chief, Jabril Rajoub, who still is around, by the way, who assures him that as long as Sharon doesn't enter the mosque or the Golden Dome or the Dome of the Rock, no problems would arise. Beseder Gomor, no problem. So in fact, Sharon went up there. He was there for about 30 minutes, didn't attempt to enter any mosques. His visit was conducted during normal hours when the area is open to tourists, but was considered to be a provocation. There were about 1,500 Palestinian youths who were up there, shouted slogans, started to inflame the situation. There were some 1,500 Israeli police at the scene. They were there to prevent violence, and the Palestinians started hurling rocks, which were in piles at the Temple Mount, leading many to believe this was a pre-planned event in terms of the Intifada. Because after Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount, Palestinians, under the explicit direction of Yasser Arafat, who had just been at the Camp David peace talks, so to speak, launched an unprecedented wave of violence and terror against Israelis. This was what became known as the Second Intifada, or the Al-Aqsa Intifada. In reality, the Intifada was planned well in advance by Arafat, who was worried that his people might think less of him or think that he was being too accommodating at Camp David in the talks that he had with Barak and Clinton. And so Sharon's visit was the pretext or the match, depending upon one's perspective, that set this off. So after that, then there was an election, and Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister, was seen as being very ineffective. He was one of Israel's shortest term prime ministers. I think it was about 2 years or so. Sharon then was elected prime minister as the head of Likud in February of 2001. He defeated Barak some 62% to 38%. And again, here's this military guy. It's first time now he's in this position of being prime minister. Don't forget what just happened. What was it in the Lebanon war, or the Operation Shalom Legalio, and he was a pariah. Now here he is, the head of Israel's government, and for the first time now, he states that the Palestinians should have the right to establish their own land west of the Jordan River. In fact, he even sent his son Omri to meet with Arafat. And he had very broad proposals, which are mentioned in the book and detailed here in the book. So in addition to Arafat's well-known rejection of the offers by Ehud Barak at Camp David, and later by Ehud Olmert, we really should add this as well. Not enough is written about that, but it was yet a third time, at that time was the second time, when Arafat refused to accept what were some very, very generous offers and conditions. Here, I'll just share with you some of what he was being offered. The Palestinians were told within 4 weeks Israel pulled its force back to the pre-Intifada lines. Final status talks would resume within a month. Sharon would meet Arafat. Israel would carry out a further deployment of their troops. They would refrain from unilateral acts in Jerusalem. They would refrain from building any new settlements. They would release a number of Palestinian prisoners as a gesture, et cetera, et cetera. So with this, then we see that after Israel, Arafat's response was to continue the Intifada, whereas the first one was really from the top down, from the people. This was really coordinated and orchestrated by the Palestinian leadership, who were trying to get ahead, in front of and ahead of, the old thing in terms of a mob, and then somebody tries to run to get at the head of it. So after Israel was struck by continuing wave of suicide bombings from the ongoing Intifada, which had started after Sharon, had visited the Temple Mount, Barak was not very effective in keeping it down, and actually Sharon held off for the longest time and did not respond strongly to the Intifada. There were some actions here and there. There were some targeted assassinations. But the main thing that Sharon started at this time was the construction of a barrier. Now, it could be seen as a separation barrier or a security barrier, but it was around the West Bank. A survey conducted by Tel Aviv University said that 80% of Jewish Israelis believe the IDF had succeeded in military countering the Al-Aqsa Intifada by 2004, but we're not there yet. So in 2002, after the Israel was struck by the wave of killings that were going on, again, other than targeted assassinations, some military operations here and there, and the security fence that was being built, he held off. Now, the Second Intifada was especially vicious and cruel. There were about 1,000 Israelis were killed during these few years. Just to remind you of what happened then, that was the time of the terrible lynching of 2 Israeli reserve soldiers who had mistakenly wandered into Ramallah. As you may remember, that's when the Palestinian police station, they took their hands and they doused their hands in the blood of the two Israeli reservists whom they had killed, and they held it up. When there was a Italian filming crew that was filming it, they took the video camera and smashed it. They picked up the phone of one of the Israelis when his wife was calling, and they answered, and they told her what they were doing at that moment, that they were killing her husband. So it was very, very vicious. This was when a young man from Tel Aviv was lured to Ramallah with an online romance, and then he was ambushed and killed by Palestinians. This was when the ambush of Kobe Mandel, whose father had been a rabbi at the University of Maryland Hillel, was when he was killed. This was the Dolphinarium attack, when there were on a Friday night, there was some 25 young, relatively recent Russian emigres to the United States, to Israel, were going to a discotheque, and somebody came up from the beach and blew themselves up. Also, Mike's Place on Tel Aviv was blown up. This is when there was a capture of a ship by Israeli naval commandos, and at the time that Arafat was saying he had nothing whatsoever to do with it and was denying any involvement to President Bush, they found the documents that actually had Arafat's signature approving these weapons coming into Gaza. And so at that point, by the way, Bush pretty much realized that Arafat was not to be trusted, was not a partner for peace, and his attitude hardened against the Palestinians and the PLO. So back to Sharon, he's pushing forward with the construction of the separation barrier to prevent infiltration by the Palestinians. And then Passover 2002, and in Netanya, at the Park Hotel, a suicide bomber enters into the hotel, gets past security somehow, and he blows himself up, killing 30 Israelis and wounding 160. And that was the culmination of a month in which 130 Israelis have been killed in various terrorist attacks and suicide bombings. So with that, Sharon held back no longer. The following day, he launched a large-scale counterterrorism operation. Basically, had a green light from the Bush administration. It was called Operation Defensive Shield in the West Bank. It took place between the 29th of March and the 10th of May. They called up all kinds of reserve troops, and in fact, it was extraordinary because if Israel, let me just use numbers here, would need, let's say, 50,000 troops from the reserves, they would call up 60,000 because they know that somebody, is going to be sick or somebody can't come or whatever. When they called up whatever number it was, they needed 50,000. I'm just making up the numbers. They called up like 60,000, and they wound up having 65,000 people come. Again, those numbers I'm making, but just to show you, they had more than what they had even called for, because people, number one, were fed up with the attacks, and number two, because there was great confidence in Ariel Sharon, especially in terms of calling upon them, and especially also because Israel had held back to a large extent. So what the IDF did was to make sweeping incursions throughout the West Bank into numerous Palestinian cities, and this was when Arafat was put under siege in his Ramallah compound, if you remember that as well. So eventually, that Second Intifada was put down. Now, in May of 2003, and now here's where we start to begin to see some of the changes. So up until now, I've presented and I've shared with you a lot of details, hopefully not too many, and I hope the story was interesting to you, and I didn't lose anybody on this, but of his military actions and of his strategies and things like that. So now we go to May 2003, and Sharon endorses Bush's roadmap for peace. The President George W. Bush came across as a very strong supporter of Israel. As I said, he gave Sharon the green light to be able to go forward with the operation, and he understood. But Bush had also said, was the first American president to call for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So it's a little bit, giving with one hand, taking with the other, so to speak, in the Israeli mind. But the quartet of the United States, the European Union, and Russia, it's only three, I forgot who the fourth was. Anyway, opened a dialogue with Mahmoud Abbas and stated their commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state in the future, and Sharon accepted it. He told Bush he was prepared to make painful sacrifices for peace. So why was that? Well, for one thing, this was after Saddam Hussein was gone. And so they felt now there was no major country, other than Iran, but no major country that was threatening Israel. And also Bush had promised the Palestinians they would be able to have their state only after the terror infrastructure had been removed and dismantled among the Palestinians. So here's what happens. June of 2003, elections are taking place. Sharon's opponent, the head of the Labour Party, is Amram Mitznah, who called for withdrawal from the settlements in the Gaza Strip and said that that should happen. Mitznah was overwhelmingly defeated because he was campaigning on a platform of disengagement that, guess what? Guess who ultimately adopted it? You can see where we're going with this. Sharon, incidentally, by the way, during the campaign, he referred to the Gaza communities as, quote, no different than Tel Aviv. He said that the Jewish settlements in Gaza are of such strategic value that the fate of Netzarim is the same as the fate of Tel Aviv, meaning it is integral part of Eretz Yisrael and the Medinat Yisrael. So in 2005, so here, this is election 2003. 2004, he brings his proposal to withdraw from the Gaza, which he had campaigned against, and he brings that to the Knesset. In fact, he mocked Mitznah when he said that, and really put him down. But now he adopts that plan. 2004, it's approved, and in the summer of 2005, there's a complete unilateral withdrawal of Israeli troops. All settlers are removed. All of the settlements are dismantled. The only things that were left were some greenhouses, which the Palestinians quickly destroyed because they were left there for them to be able to use it for exporting, and some synagogues, which they thought could be used as community centers. Those were also destroyed right away. Now, needless to say, and here's where we get to the reason why it's in this book, Be Strong and of Good Courage. Sharon faced strong opposition from his own Likud party and from other right-wing Israelis. They challenged him on national security grounds. How can you do this? On military grounds, as well as even on religious grounds. But the move was welcomed by the Palestinian Authority, by Israel's left wing, and it was seen as a step toward a final peace settlement, all of which was a really very shocking move on Sharon's part. He had been considered, I've told you about how much he built, well, so much so that he was always considered the father of the settlement movement. But Sharon's readiness in this final phase of his career to accept some form of a Palestinian state and to order Israeli withdrawal from Gaza against the opposition of many of his supporters was a dramatic shift. And the question then is why? Why did he make this fundamental change and really do a 180? Was it that his outlook had changed? Was it tactical opportunism, as his critics asserted? Was it something else? Well, in an April 2004 letter to Bush, by the way, I was in Israel that summer of 2005 when and it was broadcast on Israeli television as the soldiers went into these settlements and would take out the 9,000 settlers. Some of them came out right away willingly, but others were like clinging to their homes. Some of them were clinging to the Torah scrolls that were there. And it was an amazing scene, by the way. I gave a sermon about it, I spoke about it at the time when I came back, because you saw these soldiers who were evicting fellow Israeli citizens from there. And it was very, very hot summer, and they were doing their job, and it was very hot. And literally, I saw on the TV, there were, the settlers who were there, they would be giving, water to the Israeli soldiers who were there to take them out forcibly. It was an extraordinary a moment, and very heart-wrenching. Even people who were in favor of the move and everything felt the difficulty and the pain that was involved in all of this. So with all of that, he withdrew all of the troops, and here's what I want you to know. In April of 2004, he wrote a letter to Bush stating that there exists no Palestinian partner with whom to advance peacefully toward a settlement. And as a result, that was one of the reasons why he took this. And again, keep in mind, it was a unilateral move. That's very, very important. It wasn't anything that was negotiated. And some people said, okay, even if you want to do this, at least let's negotiate. At least let's get something in return. But he said, no, we're just getting the hell out of there. So part of this was based on the fact that in April of 2004, President Bush wrote an important letter to Sharon, which has been referred to then, especially during the Obama administration. And Bush declared American policy was that the June 67 borders would not be Israel's final borders. Now, Obama did not follow that policy, by the way. But Bush's letter guaranteed that would be America's position. He said also, Palestinian refugees would have to return to a Palestinian state, and they would not be able to return to Israel. And so that so-called Palestinian right of return was negated. And number three, he said that Israel would be able to retain settlement blocks in the West Bank. So that's part of what gave Sharon the confidence then to both withdraw and to enter into negotiations and embrace the roadmap for peace. There were other factors. In September of 2003, a number of reserve Air Force pilots had written a letter saying they would not take part in missions any longer into the West Bank and Gaza. There were also some other generals who had said that they were disturbed by Israel's actions. So this was accumulating. Now we have a couple of other factors that were going on as well. And that is that there were accusations of bribery and financial impropriety leveled against Sharon. Somehow, $3 million suddenly mysteriously appeared in his son's bank accounts. And in fact, one of his sons was convicted and served time in prison for this. And without going into too much detail, what does that have to do with anything? At the risk of sounding conspiratorial, and I'll share with you what the theory is, that Israel's press is very well known as being very liberal, left-wing, and that Sharon, being Sharon, was constantly being criticized, as were all Likud ministers. By making this move, which was appealing to the left wing, a lot of that criticism dissipated in the Israeli press and in that part of the public. And so there are those who are cynical and say, aha, that was one of the reasons why I did it. I'm not at all saying he did or didn't do it for that. I'm just sharing with you that that is what some have said. But so what happened was, at this point in November of 2005, he resigned as head of Likud. He dissolved parliament and formed a new party. That new party was called Kadima, which means forward. And in those polls in November, it was clear that Sharon was going to be returned and reelected as prime minister. And that Netanyahu, with whom his rival, was now the head of Likud. Sharon had a stroke a few months before he was, right before he was expected to win a new election, and he was widely interpreted as intending to clear Israel out of a good portion of the West Bank in a series of further unilateral withdrawals. So when he became incapacitated, Ehud Omer replaced Sharon as the leader of Kadima, and the rest is history there, as you know. He then was in a vegetative coma for several years, and it was a couple of months later that the cabinet declared that he was no longer able to function as the head of the government. Now, I want to bring this to a conclusion and then open it up for any questions, comments, and if we have a chance to talk a little bit about what's going on right now. Let's say I have a question from Maxine. How about the huge cost to defend the Gaza? Yes, okay, thank you very much. So among the reasons also why he was willing to pull back, in addition to the Bush guarantees that he had, and he felt that these were no longer a security for Israel. It's interesting, you know, Makovsky and Ross didn't mention it, which is why I forgot about that, so thank you. But there were many people who were feeling that the expenditure of defense and the Israeli forces that had to be there in the Gaza Strip, and those guys were being attacked, was a tremendous price for Israel to have to pay as well, both in terms of lives lost as well as the economic function, and also what, like Rabin had said, what it was doing to Israeli soldiers. Now, here's one of the things that's very important, and I heard this from a number of times when Sharon was prime minister, attributed to him, and that is his view changed and his perspective changed as he looked at his responsibility differently. And one of the famous things that Sharon said, and maybe some of you heard this before, he said that he would be in his cabinet office and he would say, you know, what you see from here, pointing to the chair that he sat in as prime minister, is you don't see from there. Very powerful, powerful statement. What you see from here, you don't see from there. In other words, when he was in the opposition, when he was not in the government, he was sharply critical of Israel not taking stronger actions, and many of the things that as prime minister he did. But then he said, he looked at it very, very differently. So the denouement to his life story, he led 3 different Israeli parties, ranging from right-wing to centrist in ideology. One last thing I want to say about Ariel Sharon. He was the last of the founding, he was always considered the last of the founding generation of Israel's leaders. And that's another reason why he felt he was the one who would be able to bring this peace and be able to, and had that responsibility. He felt that those who were born later wouldn't have the same sense of obligation that he did, and that the other founding fathers did as well. And so with that, we have then an overview and assessment of Ariel Sharon and the decision that he made to shape Israel's destiny. With that, I open it up for any questions or comments or additions or things that either you agree with that I said or disagree with, or perhaps anything that I left out. Please feel free to unmute yourselves. Anybody? Mark Gerber, you're on. And then Ambassador Shifter.
We could probably do a whole fifth session on this, but when you talked about in the beginning about why they didn't talk about the Iraq bombing, and they talked about wanting decisions that went against their interest or the constituencies.
Right.
Really, the theme of the book, to some degree, is decisions that they made that were difficult decisions, but to either establish a Jewish state or to maintain the Jewishness of the Jewish state. Or part of their theme is the big picture you have to address, is this idea of being either a binational state or being only a Jewish state, which requires a two-state solution. And we only have a few minutes, so you could probably do a whole hour, but I don't know if you want to comment on that theme of theirs.
No, I think you hit it on the head. That was great. For each of these guys, I think you're right. That was an overriding. First of all, they were obviously concerned with the security of Israel, the well-being of Israel, but also preserving it as a Jewish state. So even people who are on the left, for example, and are willing to make concessions, at the end of the day, they're doing it for the same reason as the people on the right who don't want the concessions. Saying, no, this is how we preserve a Jewish state. And it's very interesting, the debate in Israel. We often talk about how heated it is and how contentious it can be. I found that actually there oftentimes there's animosity, but there oftentimes was tremendous respect. Even when Rabin was in power, and they mentioned, and Sharon was in the opposition, and Sharon would disagree publicly with Rabin's position, but Rabin would call him in order just to get some of his military insights about stuff. So the point is, they always had that view and vision of the bigger picture of the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. Thank you. Ambassador Shifter, please, if you would unmute yourself. You have to push the unmute button where you see the picture of the microphone. Click on that. Still don't have. You have to click where the microphone is, which should be, it's a computer at the bottom left. As you're looking for that, let me just see if somebody else had a comment or question while you're waiting to unmute. Stan, and then in the meantime, please try and unmute Ambassador Shifter. Yeah, go ahead, Stan.
I would agree with what Mark said, but his comment also I would add to what Ariel Sharon said, that the leaders that were profiled in the book and that you discussed so nicely, went from military career to being statesmen. They were very skillful as prime ministers, but they weren't what I would call sunny day politicians. They basically knew it was the right thing to do for the country. And again, as the theme of the book is going against the grain, they didn't they didn't care about the polls. I mean, they looked at them, but they basically acted in the best interest of the country. And today around the world, in Israel, here in this country, in other countries, the politicians, the leaders of the country, they look at the polls before they decide what they're going to do that day. These people that the leaders of Israel for these first profiled leaders, they didn't act that way. They acted in the best interest of the country, what they knew to be right.
I remember specifically saying when I was studying in rabbinical school in 74 and 75, when Rabin was prime minister, and he gave a speech, and he specifically said to the country, we will have 7 tough years, that he was saying, and he gave that, tough medicine. You're right, it wasn't just a sunny day optimism kind of a thing. Nothing like, it's morning in Israel again as a political campaign. But it was always come down to security more than anything else. Ambassador Shifter, I see you've been successful.
Can you hear me now?
Please. Go ahead.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay. You made reference to the Yom Kippur War, and you pointed out that at the very beginning, Israel was in very serious trouble. And then it was possible for Sharon to lead the initiative that then regained the areas that had been lost. What had happened in between was the U.S. resupply.
Sure. We spoke about that a little bit when we talked about both Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Rabin, that the under President Nixon was very, very significant. Yes.
Well, but let me tell you how it came about. May I say
Okay.
that?
Please.
So happens, the chief of naval operations at that time, Admiral Zumwalt, was a very good friend of mine. And he told me the whole story. So let me share that with you.
Please.
And that is that he, as chief of naval operations, was getting all the information with regard to what it is that was happening in Israel, and was deeply concerned. As a matter of fact, at that particular point, turned out that Golda Meir was considering using the atomic weapon.
Sure.
And what Zumwalt explained to me was that Nixon was so preoccupied with the resignation of Agnew as vice president, they just didn't focus, and that Kissinger was opposed and Schlesinger was not sure as to what to do, that under these circumstances, what Zumwalt did, and he said it's something that he had never on other occasion done, is go out of channels, went to see Senator Jackson, Scoop Jackson, who was at that time the chairman of the Senate Defense
Armed Services
Committee, and was really a very important person, the Armed Services Committee. And he briefed Jackson fully as to what the problem was. And it was then Jackson who took the initiative to call Schlesinger, who was Secretary of Defense, and say to him that you tell the president that Israel needs to be resupplied immediately. If not, I'm going to go public and call upon you to do it. The result was Schlesinger talked to Nixon. Nixon said, go ahead.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Let me
just add, after Zumwalt, I'd known Zumwalt for many years and we became good friends. After he died, one of the things that his family mentioned to me was his mother had been Jewish.
Fascinating. Thank you. Let me just say that to try and tie these things together, along the lines of some of what has been shared just a few moments ago, and that is that Israel has been very fortunate. You know, these are only 4 of Israel's leaders, but certainly there were other key individuals as well, including individuals such as Golda Meir, who have served Israel as prime minister, and others. They've always had very, very difficult decisions to make. You know, one of the other things that's also different is the prime minister, you know, the old joke about the prime minister of Israel talking to the president of the United States saying his job is more difficult. And they say, how's that? And he said, well, the president of the United States says, I'm the president of 350 million people. The president of Israel, the prime minister of Israel says, yeah, but I'm the prime minister of 6 million prime ministers. So that everyone considers themselves to be a prime. But in reality, if there's a garbage strike, if there's a strike at the dock, it's a national issue. It's not dealt with by a governor or a mayor or things like that. If there's a teacher strike, it's a national issue. So in addition to all the security and all the economic and all those other issues, Israel deals with these things as a nation. And as a result, it's very important that they always have this outlook and perspective of a nation, of a people. And there's, of course, the ties to the Jewish community around the world. Israel's been blessed with leaders who are willing to take fateful decisions and make difficult decisions in order to secure the establishment of the state of Israel and to procure its security and well-being. And we can only hope that going forward, that it will continue to be blessed with individuals and that their decisions. The last thing I want to say is some of these decisions can only really be viewed in hindsight as to whether how correct they were. And whether it was a judgment on Oslo, for example, which is judgment is very different today than it was when it first occurred, and so on. Some of these things one must look through the long vision of history, which often is very difficult as well. So with that, we've had a chance over these last 4 weeks to study about Israel profiles and courage. I want to thank everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a chance to study together again with some other fascinating programs as well. So
thank you, Rabbi. Really enjoyed it.
Boker Tov, Rabbi.
Same here.
Also, Boker Tov to Ambassador Schiff.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Wonderful to see everybody. Thanks so much for being a part.
Rabbi, it was excellent. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good. Look forward to being able to see everybody in person sometime.
Rabbi, I regret I missed the prior sessions. Did you record those at all by chance?
Yeah. Who was that who's asking that? I couldn't quite.
Mike Reichbach.
Oh, sure. Mike, yes. If you go on the B'nai Tzedek website, b'naitzedek.org, and then you click on the top where it says click here for our videos or whatever, and then you'll see each of the previous 3 lectures is available there. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Super well done. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. Okay.